Thanks, Alex. Back in January of last year to give this talk, and there was an ice storm, and I chickened out on driving over here. Ever since I moved to Arkansas in 1979, I've thought if we could just somehow put Mississippi somewhere else, it would be easier for me to come back home. I want to thank the Alabama Humanities Foundation for supporting this program and the Friends of the Archive. And I also want to acknowledge Sherry Hamill, who is now retired from the department, but she facilitated the accession of the coverlet that I'm going to talk about, which is out in the lobby in a display case, and a couple of other textile objects from our family. And so our family's been very grateful that those pieces of Alabama history found a permanent home here. And I also want to just mention the University of Alabama Press, which published Earline's Pink Party. Like museums and archives, university presses are nonprofit institutions that are vital for historical research, and as well as the publication of narrative nonfiction like my book. Earline's Pink Party is a biography of my grandmother, Earline Moore Findley. And she was an ordinary woman who lived in Tuscaloosa during the Jim Crow era. Biographies are challenging to write for many reasons, not the least being that our subjects may not want us to write about them. And they may prove to be unlikable subjects. Or if they are likable, it can become hard to stop the empathy that we need as biographers from slipping into sympathy. And then there's the question of whether any particular individual is going to be worth reading about. That makes biographies of famous people or people of important achievements safer bets for writers like me. Earline would not have wanted me to write about her. She evidently was not an entirely nice person. And she certainly wasn't famous or particularly accomplished, except in the domestic arts of her day. So why did I spend years studying her life and writing about her? Well, I began this book at a time when I wanted to start a new research project, but I wasn't really free to travel. But I had at hand a whole giant assortment of things I had recently inherited: furniture, textiles, books, dishes, costume jewelry. And I wasn't really sure what to do with all of that. I imagine one or two of you have been in that same situation. Many of those things originally belonged to Earline. I had taken some courses in material culture in graduate school, and it occurred to me that I might be able to write about Earline by studying the things she left. She had always been a highly mysterious figure to me. She died before I was born, but the house she kept in Tuscaloosa had been preserved almost like a shrine. And since I spent a lot of time there as a child, I had a very intense awareness of her and a lot of questions about her. And because I grew up here in the 1960s, I naturally wondered how Earline perceived race relations. As for why anyone else might be interested in Earline, I'll read you a few lines from the introduction. And I call the introduction to the book The Female Elemental. Was Earline a willing actor or a witless puppet in the continual enactment of the Old South fantasy? Did she accept that lost cause religion, to use the term coined by the historian Charles Reagan Wilson? This is my second question about Earline, the same one the sociologist Irving Goffman raised about any individual who attempts to project an identity she has chosen. Was she fully taken in by her role as gracious mistress, or did she recognize that she was performing? If the latter, did she realize that the servants also were performing? And if she knew the servants only pretended to be grateful, did she nonetheless feel that her world was safe and beautiful? In her monumental work within the plantation household, Black and White Women of the Old South, the historian Elizabeth Fox Genovese made explicit value judgments about Sarah Gale, an Alabama woman who was a neighbor and friend of Earline's great-grandparents. Gale's finest qualities, Fox Genovese wrote, cannot be divorced from her willing complicity in a social system that permitted her to flourish through the enslavement of others. Her experience and perceptions as a woman depended upon the social system in which she lived. In confronting the life of my maternal grandmother, I can do no less than Fox Genovese. Earline was a party to the systematic post-emancipation subjugation of African Americans, a beneficiary of the terrorism that imprisoned many black day laborers almost as much as if they were slaves. But merely to brand Earline a racist, or even to describe the entire history of our family's involvement in slavery and segregation, is not to understand how any such woman could occupy an ugly, dangerous world without trying to change it. Some privileged white women and men in Earline's world stood up to racial tyranny. My third fundamental question is, why didn't she? There are three things I want to talk about briefly today, and my first is the Pink Party itself, because I consider the party a work of performance art, with Earline's house as both her stage and her self-portrait. The party is an example of the ways that bourgeois homemakers, whom many of us tend to think of as frivolous and without power, took creative actions to give their lives meaning. And I have a series of pictures to show you so you can envision that party with me. My second topic is the coverlet, which is in the lobby, which Earline encountered when she married into the Findley family. The coverlet demonstrates the ways that material objects can serve as historical evidence. And to share that topic with you, I'm going to read a passage about the coverlet from the book. And then my last topic today will be the most surprising discovery that I made about Earline, and I'll share what I think that means for all of us. So to the Pink Party. The title of the book refers to a tea that Earline gave in December 1948. It was a reception for Joy Pearson, the daughter of the choir director at Earline's church, and it was a highlight of the week for the women at First Methodist. The tea was a chance for Earline to display the renovations that she and her husband Herbert had recently completed at their bungalow on University Boulevard. They had the two-sided front porch enclosed, and that enabled them to expand the living room and add a bay window and a sun porch, giving Earline more space for entertaining. The changes essentially erased the open craftsman style of the house, creating a more sheltered haven from the noisy road and the entrance to Bryce Hospital, the asylum across the street. The house and furnishings that the Findleys preserved after Earline's death, along with two short reports about the party in the Tuscaloosa News, provide a picture of the event. She incorporated her beloved pink and green color scheme into the decorations, placing pink roses and poinsettias in vases and pink candles on the table and mantel. She assembled trays of pink canapes and sweets. She even turned her Christmas tree pink by covering its cedar branches with tinted flocking, a substance made of soap flakes and water to resemble snow. In Chapter 8, I take the reader through the party as Earline's guests would have experienced it. On Wednesday afternoon, December 22nd, with the guests soon to begin arriving, Earline checked the trays of cookies and lit the tapers in the old silver candlestick holders. She glanced around the living room at the Christmas tree, the freshly painted walls, and the hooked rugs. Everything seemed to be ready. According to the newspaper, 200 women passed through the bungalow during the Pink Party. After parking up and down the sides of University Avenue, as the thoroughfare was then known, they proceeded along the sidewalks. The Camellia japonica in the middle of the side lawn may have been blooming. Beyond its pink and white flowers, one glimpsed a wide, spacious breezeway connecting the car barn and the kitchen entrance of the house. Panels and canopy brackets of cast iron trim in an elegant pattern of spiral sea scrolls with acanthus leaves decorated the breezeway and the new porticos. A curving walkway encouraged visitors to slow their pace as they approached the front door, adding to the drama of arrival. Inside, the first impressions were of the Findley's daughter, Anne. From the front door, one immediately saw her piano. Turning to enter the room, one saw her large portrait. her dress matching the green of the walls, her hair unnaturally blonde, her eyes unnaturally bright blue. The portrait was by Nina Ross Searcy Struss, a Tuscaloosa woman who was descended, as the Tuscaloosa News once explained, on both sides, from men and women noted for their broad culture and mental achievements. Below the portrait, there was a massive chaise longue, or chaise lounge, as many of us were taught to say, an antebellum piece that belonged to Herbert's grandparents at one time. Earline had reacquired the chaise by trading a more modern sofa for it and had it upholstered in green velvet. A carved gentleman's chair anchored a sitting area before the fireplace. Earline covered this chair herself, using a French-style tapestry fabric in pink, mint green, and brown on a taupe background. She carefully cut and measured the sections so that the opening in the middle distance of the tapestry scene, which provided a view of distant trees, was in the center of the chair's inside back. Another painting by Nina Struss, a floral still life, hung above the mantel. The Tuscaloosa News reported that Joy wore a dress of pale green crepe, and Anne, who was a 20-year-old student at the university and the official hostess of the party, wore a fancy frock of blush pink crepe. This is a picture of Anne wearing a different dress, but during the same period. The fancy frock was lost, alas. Anne and Earline greeted their guests informally, as the society writer put it in the newspaper, before inviting them to move into the dining room for coffee or tea. The open-work crocheted tablecloth and boat-shaped crystal bowl on the dining table were standard parts of contemporary Tuscaloosa decor. Earline's china and crystal, both introduced in 1922, the year after she married, were distinctly modern patterns. Woodland by Fostoria, crystal, and Eden china by Theodore Haviland. A decanter in the china cabinet was amusingly embellished in gold leaf with the symbols of the four houses of cards. It probably was a prize in a bridge game, but for anyone who knew the Findleys, it evoked the card-playing prowess of Herbert's grandfather, Murkison Findley. The most dramatic furnishings in the dining room were the 8 black belt chairs. Their backs and arms, a continuous graceful line, the design and elegant interpretation of Empire style by an antebellum French furniture maker, Francois Signoret of New Orleans. One of the chairs was a family heirloom. Whether it actually came from Signoret's shop is unknown. The others were copies that Earline commissioned, and by the way, from a furniture maker right here in Montgomery. To maintain a one-way flow of traffic through the house, the assistant hostesses probably encouraged guests to depart through the sun porch, which Earline had furnished with an eye-catching rattan chair in the form of a planter or Campeche chair. It was a recognizable symbol of plantation society. But expressed in rattan, it was highly fashionable in the 1940s. The cushion was covered in pieced sections of pink, green, yellow, and natural canvas. This is a different fabric, but in the same colors. And a tall tray table beside the chair echoed the colors of the cushion. So when Earline received her guests in her transformed house, each piece of furniture and every decorative object contributed to the overall effect of an artistic home. And many items promised stories for anyone who asked about their provenance. Considered together, Earline's renovation of the bungalow and her interior arrangements of furniture and objects, combinations that were antebellum, postbellum, and modern, original and reproduction, American, British, and European, inherited, reclaimed, and purchased, preserved or refinished, suggests that she made decorative choices according to no standard but her own taste. Now, this is a detail of the coverlet that's out in the lobby. On the day of the pink party, Earline probably invited all of her guests to put their coats and bags on the bed in the front bedroom, which was Anne's bedroom. But they probably didn't see this blanket. The family regarded this as such an important artifact that it was never used and always stored in a cedar chest. The family story about the coverlet is the finale of chapter 3, a chapter that I call Legends. I'm going to read a little bit from that. A brilliant red and green woolen coverlet, the initial I embroidered in one corner, marking it as Ida's, was in pristine condition, carefully stored to protect it from moths. Known in the family as the New Albany coverlet, the double-faced jacquard piece had an image of the 1851 Alabama Capitol, a background of alternating crimson and green triangles in the birds in air pattern, a central wreath and star pattern of grapes, roses, leaves, and a sunburst, and a border of grapes and urns. This lightweight blanket was the subject of a story that Lula Hargrove carefully documented in a letter to Herbert on the occasion of his passing the coverlet on to Anne, the details coming from stories Lula had heard and her own early memories. And this short letter from Lula is also in the collection here. In 1874 or 1875, Tenatus and Minerva Hargrove commissioned a mill in New York to make a woven coverlet with wool from the family farm for each of their children. One of the family's former slaves, Aunt Jane, prepared the wool for shipment in home woven bags. When the Civil War was over and the Negroes all free, Aunt Jane didn't want to leave her white folks, Lula wrote. She was given a house and all the land around it that she wanted for a garden, cotton patch, chicken yard, etc., free of rent, near the big house, as long as she lived. Each week, Aunt Jane got a supply of groceries, and each day a meal if she wanted it at Master and Mistress' kitchen. She lived many years, always loyal to the family of Hargrove, father and son. Close quote. Referring to Tenatus's brother James, Lula added, Aunt Jane grieved for Marse Jimmy, who died in a federal prison at Vicksburg. She ended her story. When Aunt Jane died, she was buried by the white folks she had loved and served and who had served her. Close quote. Now, some of Lula's statements are verifiable. Tenatus produced 40 pounds of wool from 30 head of sheep in 1870. Carding wool was a routine chore for black and white women on small farms. The bags in which the Hargroves shipped the wool could have been home woven. Lula's approximate date of 1875 for the coverlets makes sense because textile manufacturers marketed a selection of commemorative designs for coverlets directly to wool-producing farm families. So it's plausible that the mill that purchased wool from the Hargroves also offered designs such as the Alabama Capitol. The centennial of the American Revolution in 1876 was one of the historic events that such coverlets typically commemorated, hence the common reference to centennial coverlets. New Albany could have referred to Albany County, New York, where the Harmony Manufacturing Company established the largest textile mill in the world in 1872. And Lula could have confused the New York County with the town of New Albany, Mississippi. In addition to the details about the provenance of the coverlet, Lula's background description of the Hargrove household is credible. The second and third generations of Hargroves in Tuscaloosa were slaveholders. Tenatus's brother James did die of typhoid fever while he was a prisoner of war, although he was in Alton Federal Military Prison in Illinois, not Vicksburg. Jane's identity, however, is a mystery. Lula glossed over the servant's surname by referring to her simply as Aunt Jane in quotation marks, which implied an affectionate relationship between the Hargroves and the elderly woman. She could have wanted to obscure the fact that she and Jane had the same last name. A 60-year-old black woman named Jane Hargrove lived in the vicinity of the Hargrove Farms in 1870. Since that Jane was born in Virginia about 1810, she could have been in one of the droves of enslaved workers and children who were herded like cattle to Alabama. Lula's characterization of Jane as a loyal and contented former slave who chose to remain dependent on the Hargroves is questionable. Did Jane stay on the Hargrove farm because the Hargroves were good owners, or because she was isolated with no means of transportation or contacts who could help her get settled elsewhere? Did the Hargroves threaten Jane, as Robert Jemison Jr. did his employees, warning that if they left his land, they couldn't return? Did the Hargroves provide housing for old and infirm freed people because federal authorities compelled them to do so? And did Lula's parents neglect to mention that detail to her? Did the Hargroves pay Jane for her labor? Or, like some former slaveholders in Alabama, merely provide shelter and food, just as in slavery days? Perhaps the Hargroves promised Jane a coffin and a burial spot in the family cemetery as an inducement to stay on the farm. A planter down in Marengo County did exactly that. Some white people considered black funerals or black deaths opportunities, like black weddings, to exhibit noblesse oblige by contributing to burial arrangements, arranging for a newspaper report, or even attending funeral services. But despite Lula's claim about Jane's final resting place, there is no evidence of Jane in the Hargrove family cemetery located near Duncanville, and there seems to be no record at all of where the freedwoman Jane Hargrove died or where she was buried. Past middle age, at war's end, Jane could have chosen the predictability and security of working for the Hargroves over starting a new life elsewhere. She could have been grateful that the Hargroves supported her instead of evicting her. She may even have considered herself a faithful member of the Hargrove family, as Lula believed. But the essence of Lula's story, that the coverlet was material evidence of the gratitude of a dependent black servant, is impossible to confirm. Lula's letter about the coverlet reflected the prevailing white view of slavery. Although she didn't call Jane a mammy, in other regards, she expressed the attitude that was typical of postbellum upper-class white families, that mammies still belonged to them. Lula's story of Aunt Jane was part of the fantasy of the Old South, that set of ideas that dominated wishful thinking about African Americans at the time Earline became a Findley. And that brings me to the last idea I want to share with you today, one that I think makes the story of this obscure and unremarkable woman worth considering. Despite having a loving, perhaps even adoring husband and a comfortable upper middle class life, Earline never felt safe. She believed that if she could be beautiful, she would be loved. And if she were loved, she would be safe. But she always felt those were unattainable goals. Because of a pattern in her mother's family across generations of maternal and infant deaths, she probably didn't develop a strong attachment in infancy to a primary caregiver. And because her father was a poor provider and probably an alcoholic, she experienced economic insecurity and social embarrassment as a child. She lived her entire life in a landscape of fear, a place of epidemics and fires and floods and tornadoes and car crashes, and most significantly, the fear that black men could attack, rob, rape, and murder white women at any time. A fear not based on reality, but promulgated by the white ruling class to motivate white working class men to remain compliant in an economic system that didn't benefit them. A fear reinforced by lynchings around the South, including a horrific series of lynchings in Tuscaloosa in 1933, events of which Earline was very aware. There have been recent findings in the neurosciences that indicate that children who don't have secure emotional attachments and who live in frightening surroundings can literally fail to develop the capacity for empathy. Empathy isn't sympathy, but the ability to actually imagine another person's experience, to walk in her shoes. And I think a lack of empathy rendered Earline literally incapable of caring about the African Americans who lived around her. What does this mean for us? That universal early care and education with early intervention in the lives of at-risk children between birth and the third birthday to ensure that they receive careful, positive, consistent, responsive attention from parents and other caregivers so they grow up believing they are safe is the most important way we can finally create a civil society. These lines are from the conclusion to the book, which I call Self-Portrait. Earline was driven by fear that her family's tranquil home life would be destroyed. As the geographer Yifu Tuan put it, Earline's screens of cherry laurel and camellia were an attempt to keep inimical forces at bay. Her objective was not to retreat from a public stage, but to retreat from the dangers of the exterior world. As her heart gave out, she retreated further to a bedroom sanctuary, an air-conditioned, shadowy space where, in the words of the material culture scholar Beverly Gordon, a woman might achieve a kind of heightened experience that was aesthetically and sensually charged and full, a saturated interior world. In the addition of lavender to Earline's palette, we see traces of her final dreams. Sometime between the Pink Party and her death in 1953, Earline had this final photographic portrait made. Wearing a brooch of enameled pink roses with bright blue accents, the blue matching an opalescent hobnail ruffled vase on the table in the bay window of the living room, and the trailing morning glories in the floral still life by Nina Struss. But more than any party or photograph, her house was how Earline wanted to be seen and remembered. And the story she would have wanted me to tell you about her was that she created a beautiful home. Thank you.
We now have time for some questions, so if you have a question you'd like to ask, feel free to raise your hand. I'll bring you the microphone so that everyone will be able to hear it.
Thank you for sharing all that with us. I'm curious what happened to all that furniture?
Well, as I said, there was a lot of it. Earline and Herbert had two children, my mother Ann and Ann's brother Lyman, and so the contents of the bungalow eventually were divided between them, and then when my mother died, I got all of the stuff she'd gotten, so that was half of the contents of a pretty large house. And it took me a while to kind of wade through all of that, but ultimately I gave all of the pieces that were in one way or another significant to Tuscaloosa history to the university. And the university plans to put some of them in Bryce Hospital as that project, which I think is an ongoing project of renovation and repurposing. And then some of the pieces are in some kind of guest quarters they have for visiting professors. So, it's like the work that the Department of Archives and History does here in maintaining its collections. These objects are just as important as documents in allowing us to study history. We appreciated that the university did that.
I'm wondering, can you hear me? Okay.
I can hear you.
I'm wondering if she had servants and what kind of staff she worked with.
Yeah. Well, when she was growing up, there were no servants. The family was quite poor in comparison to aunts and uncles on both sides. Herbert had a decent income, first as a Chancery Court judge and then as a professor at the university. And so during the years that Earline was a mother and wife and had this party and everything, she always had at least two people working for her, a woman inside the house who was the cook and housekeeper and child care giver, and then a gardener. Anybody else? Yep. Yes, sir.
Oddly speaking, I noticed the floor in one or two of your pictures, floor of the home, Had that floor been put in since she passed on?
No, sir. No, sir.
It was original?
Yes, the family used a stock plan. There were a lot of catalogs available in the teens and 20s for craftsman-style houses, and they bought a stock plan, but then they used materials from one of the family's farms. They cut all the lumber for the house on the place. And
Okay.
so it may have been longleaf pine or yellow pine.
Well, I thought it was rather interesting, and especially in today's time, when you find floors very similar in many homes, and not always, but many.
Well, I'm staying right now in an Airbnb house in the Cloverdale district that is a craftsman bungalow that was built in 1916. And as I was telling my husband and our friend who's here with us, I feel almost as if I'm back in Earline's house, even though it's different, but it's very similar. And the construction materials definitely look the same.
Well, let's all have another round of applause for Elizabeth Findley Shores.
Thank you.
Now, if you have any other questions you'd like to ask, feel free to come up, and you can ask them if you want to have more kind of one-on-one time with her. You also can buy her book out in the lobby, and I am sure she would be willing to sign it if you would like her to sign your book. So, thank you again for coming, and I hope to see y'all again in June. Thank you. Thank y'all.